Our topic is Israel's Gulf state deals. Can Israel bypass the Palestinians in its search for peace? Professor Podeh will start with an overview of the topic. After that, John Allen will ask some questions, and we also invite you to ask questions, which Mr. Allen will pose on your behalf. Before I introduce John Allen, I'll just say a few words about Canadian Friends of Peace Now. Our organization is partner to Peace Now in Israel. Shalom Achshav, as it's known in Hebrew, is Israel's premier peace movement. Since 1978, Peace Now has promoted a just and viable resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the formula of 2 states for 2 peoples. Peace Now protests the occupation of Palestinian territory and particularly the expansion of Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Here in Canada, we promote the Peace Now message to Canadians and encourage a deeper understanding of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We do this through various means, including webinars like this one today. Also, very important, we contribute funds to Shalom Achshav for their educational programs in Israel. We can't do any of this without your help. Every donation, large and small, helps us to keep going. So if you are able, please consider making a gift to Canadian Friends of Peace Now. You can go to our website at www.peacenowcanada.org and click on the donate button, or send a check to our mailing address, or send us an email, and we'll get back to you by phone. For any donation over $10, we'll send you a tax receipt. And now it's my very great honor to introduce our guest host, John Allen. John Allen has had a long, distinguished career as a Canadian diplomat. He joined Canada's then Department of External Affairs in 1981 and took on positions of increasing responsibility over the years. From 2006 to 2010, he served as Ambassador of Canada to Israel. He is currently Senior Fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He is also a sought-after media commentator on Middle East affairs, and his volunteer activities include being on the board of Project Rosanna. This is a wonderful organization that seeks to build bridges between Israelis and Palestinians through projects related to health. Thank you so much for joining us, John, and now over to you.
Thank you, Gabriella. Thank you to all the participants, and a particular thank you to Professor Elie Podeh, who's with us from Israel today. Elie Podeh is a visiting professor in the Department of Middle East Studies at the London School of Economics. Unfortunately, his sabbatical there was cut short by COVID, and he's now back in Israel, where he's a professor in the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he was the chairman of the department for a number of years. He has published and edited 12 books on the subjects that include the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the decline of Arab unity, and the quest for hegemony in the Middle East. He's a frequent commentator in the Jerusalem Post, in Haaretz, and other publications, and he's a board member of Mitvim, a progressive foreign policy think tank based in Tel Aviv, in Israel. We're particularly lucky and honored to have Elie with us, as he brings knowledge not only of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the elements of that part of the story, but because he understands so well the roles and the perspectives of the Gulf countries involved in this story that we're about to hear about. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Elie. He's going to speak for about 20 minutes. I'll ask him a few questions while you formulate your questions, and I hope we're going to have an extremely interesting dialogue. Elie, over to you, and thanks again for being with us.
Thank you very much. It is an honor to be here and to deliver this presentation, talking from the zone war in Herzliya, Israel, under the lockdown. I think this is really unfortunate that we are in this situation. But for at least the next half hour, let's dedicate our talk to other things and talk about some, I think, wonderful achievements. And recently I published an article which said a year of achievements, but one big failure. So first of all, let's talk about the achievements, and then we'll talk about the failure. Now, I want to divide my presentation into 4 parts, and to be very short on each part. First, I want to say something about the history and motivation of what happened recently, talking about the peace agreements. Then to say something about the timing, then about the advantages and the achievements, and finally to end with the failures and the problems. And this is connected with the title of this presentation, which is mostly relevant to the Palestinian issue. Let me just say in the background that what I'm saying is based upon something like 4 years of research. I mean, 4 years ago, I started a project that dealt with Israel's secret relations in the Middle East from 48 until 2020, or let's say until today. And at that time, I couldn't know, of course, that we are heading towards what we saw in the last month. But the idea was to look at what is going on behind the scenes, if possible. And based on many interviews that I conducted with Mossad, intelligence, and chief security people in Israel, and also all the available information, it came out to something like 600 pages of a book, which hopefully will be published by Amoved soon. First of all in Hebrew, but hopefully also in English later on. Okay, so that is for the background. Let's start with the history and motivation. We have to understand that we are talking about a long history of engagement. That means that when we talk about relations between Israel and the Emirates, Bahrain, the Gulf in general, even with Saudi Arabia, we are talking about something like 25 years of engagement, which began after the Oslo agreements in the mid-90s. So this laid a very strong infrastructure to the relations in the spheres of security, intelligence, trade, and I think that that was very crucial and important in the background to what happened recently. Now, in terms of the people who were involved, usually it's the Mossad people who are engaged in clandestine engagement with the other side. Usually the Foreign Office is responsible for relations with countries that have diplomatic relations with us. But before that, customarily, it's the Mossad. However, when we talk about the Gulf region, we find that both the Mossad and the Foreign Office, they played a crucial role. Why is that? Well, these are very particular circumstances, and it depends also on the fact that certain people who had, from the Foreign Office, who had excellent connections with the Gulf countries, they played a role. And to give you just an illustration, we are talking first of all about secret meetings between high officials on both sides. We are talking about establishing secret missions in the Emirates and in Bahrain many years ago. And we are talking about establishing a public institution which is called the IRENA, which is a UN institution, which is the International Renewable Energy Agency. And Israel from 2015 has actually a public mission there. which of course was also a product of secret engagement before that. So all in all, when we talk about the history, we see that quite a lot has happened since the 90s. Now, what about the mutual interest? So there are a few of them which are very relevant. The first one is Israel is playing a role of a balancer in the Middle East, vis-a-vis Iran, vis-a-vis the Shiites, vis-a-vis the Muslim Brotherhood, and the jihadist group. So in short, and this is something which is quite known by now, the fact that Israel, the Emirates, the Gulf in general, including Saudi Arabia, including Jordan, Egypt, you will say even Sudan and countries in North Africa, they have mutual interests because all of them are afraid from the fact that Iran and the Shiites in general, in addition, different Sunni organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, like ISIS and so on, they are very much afraid that they will have the upper hand in the Middle East and they will be able to attract the large populations in the Middle East. So in that respect, Israel is playing the balancing role against Iran, because if you want to have a partner who is strong enough in order to cope with the threats coming from there, Israel is in a good position. Secondly, Israel is a facilitator between the United States and the Arab countries. Israel and the Jewish lobby as a pressure group on the American administration when they want to receive financial support and also military arms. And by the way, there are many examples here because, for example, Israel helped Egypt and Jordan to get financial support. Israel helped to legitimize President Sisi in Egypt after the revolution or the coup, whatever you call it, in 2013. So Israel is playing a very important role for those countries. Now, this is very relevant now because we are talking all the time about the possibility that the Emirates will get the F-35. Now, I want to just to mention to all of us, those who don't know, that this is not the first time that the Emiratis are trying to get Israeli support in this regard. Let's go 25 years before. In 1995, Prime Minister Rabin, met the Emirati crown prince. He wasn't the crown prince at that time, MBZ, who is very famous and important now. And he asked him to get the Israeli consent for the purchase of F-16. We are talking about 1995, and Rabin consented. So we are talking here about a pattern already that the Emirati and other countries, they are realizing that in order to get the American support, you need to get first the support of Israel and the Jewish lobby in order to get that. And it worked quite well in the past. Probably it will work very well by now also. Next, military and intelligence and commercial cooperation behind the scenes mostly, but there are many examples of Israeli firms that are working in the Gulf. So you'll be quite surprised to learn that before the signing, or it's not, before the signing of the agreement in Washington, we are talking about something like between 200 and 300 Israeli firms operating in the Emirates. I'm talking about the pre-agreement period. Quite amazing, but that is a fact. Now, let's talk about the timing. There are push and pull factors that brought the agreement right now. Pushing elements were the US elections, the coming elections, no doubt about that. First of all, fear of an American vacuum in the Middle East following the likely withdrawal of the US from the region. That is already happening. The US more or less is withdrawing from the Middle East. It withdrew from Afghanistan, is withdrawing from Iraq, and in general, it is withdrawing from Syria and other places as well. So therefore, in such a situation, the Emiratis and the Gulf countries in general, they need Israel as a kind of replacement. Israel is much closer and in situation of a threat, imminent threat. Israel is in a possibility to help the Emiratis and others as well. Also, the possibility that Trump is a very friendly administration to the Gulf countries. That was not the situation with the previous Democratic administration led by Obama. He signed the agreement with Iran. So take into account the possibility that Biden will replace Trump. So this is a scenario that they have to take into account. Another push element is the disappointment and frustration from the Palestinian position. And it is true that many of us believe that there will be no normalization before solution, or at least progress on the Palestinian issue. However, the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, they came to the conclusion that, we are fed up. I mean, we don't see any situation that in the near future something will tremendously change. So we have done our share. And the share is that we suspended, in their view, we have abolished altogether the possibility of annexation, but nevertheless, we paid our share, and therefore we can move forward. The pull factors is the American pressure, but the American pressure is not for free. They are being given probably the F-35, as I said before, and probably other ammunition and arms as well. So this is a very heavy consideration in their point of view. And then, as I said before, the American and the Israeli promise not to suspend annexation. So this is another pull factor that was very crucial in this time. And that's decided the timing. So you have here altogether at least 4 reasons why now. What are the advantages and the achievements? First of all, it improves tremendously Israel's position in the Middle East. Israel is publicly recognized as an important actor in the Middle East. And this is not new, by the way. And that already happened with the agreement with Egypt, then with Jordan. But we are seeing here the process. We are seeing here a trend that being reinforced now and probably might also lead the way to other agreements. I will say something about it later with connection with the Palestinian issue. Next, improve Israel's image in certain places in the Middle East. The UAE and Bahrain work to promote tolerance through interfaith dialogue. I don't know if you know, but in the Emirates, you have a minister, a governmental minister, who is responsible for promoting tolerance, okay? And also the Bahrainis, they have a center who his task is to promote interfaith dialogue. And by the way, the advisor is a Rabbi Schneier, his name is, and he's quite known in his activity. Since, and also there is a lot of potential of vast cooperation in many fields, investments, tourism, medicine, agriculture, cyber, desalination. I can mention all fields which might be relevant to the possible cooperation. Now let's move to maybe the main issue on our agenda, which is the failure or the big failure. I said many achievements, but there is one big problem, and that is, of course, ignoring the Palestinian issue. And here, there are several risks. First, many in Israel may be attracted to the notion that indeed, as Netanyahu is trying to market the agreement as peace for peace. The agreement with the UAE was not free, and in any case, there is a big difference between agreement with peripheral countries who has no issues with Israel, such as borders, refugees, Jerusalem, and more. So that means that that case study is not relevant to the Palestinian issue. Many will now believe that it is possible to move forward with Arab countries without dealing with the Palestinian issue. That is a big mistake, because so far, if we are looking at Saudi Arabia, looking at Kuwait, looking at Oman, looking at Morocco, even Sudan, they said something quite clearly that they are not willing, at least for the time being, they're not willing to move forward unless they will see some sign of movement on the Palestinian front. Next, neglect. The Israeli government is neglecting what is the core of the conflict and ignoring or bypassing the crucial issue. And as time passes by, the two-state solution is simply fading away. Many are now talking of a one-state solution, but in my mind, it's not a solution, but a recipe for a fauda, okay? And I hope that by now everybody knows the word from the Israeli famous series fauda. And if anyone doesn't, then it means anarchy, it means blunder, it means a disaster. And that is the fate of a one-state solution in my mind. So the question is, to what extent the agreement damage or support the possibility of negotiations? And it goes both ways, by the way. Mitvim last fall, the respondents were divided on that issue. At present, the agreements push the PA, the Palestinian Authority, into the corner, and it will not be easy to get them out from there. Certainly not under the Trump administration. Only a new administration, a Democratic administration, Biden, can have a hope of reaching out to the Palestinians, but at the same time, chances are that any American president will be preoccupied with the domestic economic situation. To add to that, the situation on the Palestinian front is not promising. Aging leadership and uncertainty as for who is going to replace Abu Mazen is a very concerning issue. I mean, ask anyone, any expert on the Palestinian issue, he will not be able to give you a clear answer of who is going to replace. John, in a minute, two, I'm done.
Two more.
Secondly, the despair on the Palestinian side from the chances of a peaceful settlement. I mean, they themselves are very much frustrated, and I would say many of them just lost hope. That's the problem. They simply lost hope that Israel will be willing to move forward on that issue. And then you have the divisions between the PA and the Hamas, which are territorial, ideological, and political. And there is some possibility of coming together. You know, they are talking right now about that. And maybe they will sign an agreement. But I can tell you that in the past, all the attempts at reconciliation, I'm talking about an intra-Palestinian reconciliation, all the attempts have failed. So I will not put too much into that as well. So the question is, what can and should be done? And in my mind, quite clear. I don't think it will happen, but at least let me pose the possibility. If we assess, as I think, that the Palestinian issue is the core of the conflict and one of the reasons for Israel's domestic and external problems, then Israel has on its own to launch a generous peace plan. And my emphasis is on generous, because peace plan is not enough. We had the Trump peace plan. So this is not an opening. I don't think so. We had, you know, in the late 80s, something which was called the Shamir plan. The Israeli prime minister, he offered a peace plan. But I mean, it was a media stunt. He was just trying to move, you know, all the people and to attract them with something which was really not meaningful or attractive to the other side. So a generous peace plan taking into account, I'm saying that taking into account the political climate and composition of the government, I'm very much afraid that that will not happen. And a change in the American administration with an active support of the EU may make a change. But this is also looks quite remote. Not so much the American change. I mean, that is very much a possibility. But I mean, taking all these together, change on the American side, the Europeans playing an important role, Israel offering something in addition to the COVID situation, this is not very likely. And I very much dislike to end, with this pessimistic note. But at the same time, we have to be frank and to look at what we are facing. And this is more or less the situation right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Elie. Thank you very much for that. Comprehensive and opens up the possibility of a number of questions. I see some questions already coming in. If I may, I'll use my moderating role to ask a few. One of them is, if you look at the agreement, it appears that Israel actually gave up very little. Anshel Pfeffer of Haaretz claims that Bibi never intended to annex in the first place. Even if he did, it didn't look like annexation was going to be able to go forward. It was certainly being condemned roundly. Other than the sale of the F-35s, which could affect Israel's qualitative military edge, but we don't know about that. What did Israel give up to get this bonus of legitimization and these new arrangements?
Yeah, I agree. I agree that Israel gave very little. The Emiratis are trying to say that this is not exactly, and obviously we understand why they are saying that, because they want to show that they got a lot. The annexation issue was probably a dead horse issue at that time, by then. So Netanyahu probably understood that. So he didn't really give up on that issue. And in relation to the F-35, well, if I showed already that Israel gave it in the past, so you can understand that that was not a huge achievement as well. Yes, I agree. And that's why it's so dangerous, because you have to understand that, well, I live in Israel and I hear the voices, and the voices are very simple. Listen, he got a lot for almost nothing. So, okay, let's take it as an example and bring it to the other fronts. That is very simple. But you have to go into the details. You cannot make a comparison between a peripheral country which had no war with Israel, which has no conflict with Israel, and to bring it to the Palestinian issue. And for that matter, to the Syrian or to the Lebanese front, which are, for the time being, are not relevant, okay? But for many Israelis who are not concerned with the fact or are not interested with the fact, for them, it is an example for something different. And I think that he really hit something when he used the phrase peace for peace. And by the way, he didn't invent it. Again, Prime Minister Shamir was the first one. Right. And he said, I don't want to talk about relinquishing or withdrawing from the territories. I'm willing to have peace for peace. And that is what Netanyahu is trying to do. I myself, I'm trying, and I've written on that quite extensively. I'm trying to fight that notion because I believe it's untrue and it is irrelevant. And I think that all of us have to fight against it because it is irrelevant. But I can tell you that in terms of the media, in terms of it hit very well.
Yes.
It is a problem.
Okay, let me take a look at another aspect. On the one hand, the UAE and Bahrain have said that they have not abandoned the Palestinians. In fact, they're going to use this to push the Palestinian cause. How realistic is that? And on the other hand, and perhaps more negatively, can these agreements withstand another Gaza war? Can they withstand an attempt in a couple of years by Bennett or Bibi to try and annex again? Can they withstand a third intifada? What is going to happen if the situation turns more difficult in Israel? Perhaps it won't, and we hope it won't. So two sides of that question.
Yeah, excellent questions. Okay, every one of them, let me deal. As for the Palestinian card, there is some truth in it, yes, and I've written about it as well. And I think that what the Emirati gained, and that is important, maybe the most important thing, is that they gained the leverage on Israel. It's the same leverage that Egypt and Jordan has, meaning that if you do something on the Palestinian issue, we might respond. And that is connected with the other question that you asked, which is the other side. And the question is, okay, what can they do? I mean, how can they respond? And you know what? So far, not much. I'm saying so far, because that can change. If I'm going, because I'm a historian and I'm using history, as a lesson, what can I learn from history? So let's go to previous wars. In Lebanon, 82, the Gaza wars, we had 3 exchanges, we had 3 wars in 9, 12, and 14. At most, the Jordanian and the Egyptians, they called back the ambassador. They didn't abolish, they didn't sever relations, they simply called the ambassador back. Sometimes for years, by the way. I'm not diminishing the importance of that, but let's say that if most of the relations are conducted between the intelligence and the security, the fact that you withdraw the ambassador is not that important. Let's face it. But nevertheless, this is the card that they have. The toughest card that they have, which they haven't used so far, is severing diplomatic relations. That is a possibility. And I think that this is something that Israel has to take into account. Talking about a third intifada, that is a possibility. Yes, I agree. Maybe they will use it. But you know what? I will ask the question from a different angle. What are the prospects for a third intifada? Now, from what I am learning, and I don't consider myself an expert specifically on the Palestinian issue, but I read all the time. And I can tell you that the prospect for initiating a third intifada look quite remote. Although in many ways you can say, listen, the ingredients for a third intifada are very much there. The frustration, the despair, what they see from Israel and from the United States. So many of us thought that the intifada is going soon to happen, is very likely, and still it didn't. So, we have a very big question mark on that. And I think also the divisions among the Palestinians, it's very important they will unite their forces. And if that will happen, that will be one sign. But still, we are not there.
Yeah. So there, a question has come in. We've seen for the first time in Turkey, the Palestinians getting their act together, the various factions. call by Mahmoud Abbas for elections within 6 months, which is long overdue, as you mentioned. Is it possible that these actions will actually lead to the Palestinians getting their act together, perhaps coming up with a draft of their own, consulting with these countries and with perhaps a Biden administration? Is it possible that there's a silver lining here that we didn't expect?
Yeah. First of all, I would like to say that it is a pity that we and the Americans, we drove the Palestinians into the hands of Turkey. I mean the Palestinian Authority. I'm not talking about the Hamas, okay? There is a big difference between the two. And I think that was, and still is the interest of Israel to cooperate with the Palestinian Authority and with Abu Mazen, who is the most moderate Palestinian ever, okay? And he did his own mistakes, by the way. We have to face that, but still, we shouldn't drive him to the hands of the Turks, who are exploiting, of course, the opportunity. They see what is going on, and the Turks, I don't want to go into that because it'll be a different topic. But the Turks, they are quite isolated in the Middle East, and they are playing on many fronts. They are playing a role in Libya. They are now playing a role in Nagorno-Karabakh, supporting the Azeris against the Armenians. And yeah, they are trying also to play a role in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and they hosted the two factions. I wouldn't discount the possibility that something at the end will emerge from there out of frustration, out of despair. As I said before, in the past, all attempts at reconciliation failed. And my colleagues, the experts on the Palestinian issue, say that they wouldn't invest too much in that reconciliation as well. But I wouldn't discount the possibility that, if worst come to worst, they will somehow be driven into the street. And you know what? Sometimes you need a spark. You don't need more than that. A spark ignited the first Intifada. A spark ignited the second Intifada as well. So you need a spark. And there are a lot of embers there, a lot of things that Trump did with his decision regarding Jerusalem, stopping the aid to UNRWA, and then the Trump peace plan. There are many, many issues that can play a role and lead the Palestinians into the street. I wouldn't discount that possibility.
Okay, let's turn a little bit. There's a number of questions that talk about Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, of course, was the initiator of the Arab Peace Initiative, which has to some extent been put aside in this deal. Instead of exchanging peace with the Palestinians for recognition, we did peace for peace. So other people say that this couldn't have gone ahead without some kind of Saudi consent. And then there's talk about, differences of opinion between MBS and the king. Can you comment on that? And can you give us an idea of whether or not, what role the Saudis will potentially play with Israel?
Yeah. First of all, the Saudis, no doubt, are playing a role behind the scenes. They gave their consent, no doubt about that. Certainly regarding Bahrain. Bahrain is, I don't want, to say something about exactly the nature of relations, but we do have to remember that the Saudis, they rescued Bahrain in 2011 during the Arab Spring. there was a rebellion there there was a revolution actually, and they were saved. The elite, the Sunni elite, we have to remember that. I mean, some of the listeners, they are not aware. 70% of the population in Bahrain is Shiite. Shiite, like the Shias in Iran. They are Arabs, not Persians, ethnically, but 70%. The 30% is Sunni, and the elite, the king, is Sunni. And in that respect, there is a lot in common between the Sunni elite and the Sunni elite in Saudi Arabia. But in Saudi Arabia, the Shiite constitute a very small minority, only 5%. So it's not an issue in Saudi Arabia. So in many respects, to many in the Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, and other countries, the continuation of the Sunni elite in Bahrain is a must. So that with respect to the Saudi connection and the Saudi consent. Now, what is going on in Saudi Arabia? Two things which are very important to remember. First of all, Saudi Arabia is a host to the holy places in Mecca and Medina. In regular times, 2 million Muslims come to Saudi Arabia, make the pilgrimage every year, annually. 2 million. Not to mention the fact that the Saudi king is the guarantor, the protector of the holy places. He's called in Arabic, Khadem el-Haramain, the protector of the two holy places. So they have to take into account what many Arabs and Muslims are thinking. And in that respect, the king, Salman, in many ways, he represents that view. His son, MBS, represents the other view. He represents the view of the younger generation. Okay, let's move ahead. The Palestinians are not interested. We are not interested as well, and so on. But so there is here, yes, there is here dispute. There are two schools of thought among the Saudi elite, and at least for the time being, I think that the king has won. And therefore, Saudi Arabia, at least in the near future, would not move forward. But, and here I want to say something which perhaps some of the listeners that are not aware or they don't know. Israel, for years, missed the Saudi position, misread the Saudi position. This is something that really, on the basis of my research, I can say for sure. And I also publish this is an academic article on Israeli-Saudi relations. And I gave there quite a few examples. I mean, it's quite amazing because under Fahd, Crown Prince Fahd, and then as a king, he sent emissaries to Israel secretly, trying to build a connection. And we rejected them. Why? For no good reason. And I think that the Saudis, for many years, they said, we recognize Israel in the 67 boundaries. They said it, not publicly. They said it to many other people. But all those people, they delivered the message to Israel. I'm sure that the Israeli governments knew that. And you mentioned correctly the two peace plans. The first one was the Fahd peace plan in 1981, which was modified by the Arab League in 82 as was offered as the Arab peace plan. That was the first Arab peace plan, which was very problematic, I must admit, but still, it offered something new. And we could have done more with that. And then when we moved to 2002, Abdallah, Crown Prince at that time, he offered the Abdallah plan, which became at that year the Arab peace plan, the second Arab peace plan, which in my mind was a huge, huge missed opportunity by Israel because more could have been done. And this is a controversial issue, but this is not the main issue here today. But I think that the bottom line is that looking backwards, Israel could have done more with the Arab peace plan.
We have a question and it relates to this. and it's the view of these states on the right of return, because we know the right of return is a key element, and many people criticize the Palestinians as saying that this is one that they'll never give up on. And there was some ambiguity, obviously, in the Arab Peace Initiative on that. What is your take based on that research that you did? Would they be prepared to see a relatively small right of return and an acknowledgement as opposed to everybody coming back?
It comes to your interpretation of the specific clause in the Arab Peace Initiative. And by the way, the same issue goes to Resolution 242, because you have different interpretations. And the Arab interpretation is that Israel has to withdraw from all the territories, but it doesn't say so specifically in the resolution. If you go to the Arab Peace Plan and to the specific resolution, Israel gained a veto power. It has to be agreed by all the parties. And they inserted Resolution 194, they talked about the return or compensation. So people say that if you say 194, you talk about the right of return. That's not what they said, because they said that, first of all, 194 offered the possibility of compensation. And secondly, it gives Israel the power to veto it, also say that we have reservations and so on. A very interesting point, this is something that I found out in my research, in that when they initially in 2002, they were talking about, okay, let's try and find a formula that will be forthcoming or that will be accepted by Israel. And then when they formulated the phrasing of this specific clause, in my mind, in their mind, their mind, they thought, wow, this is a phrasing that might be acceptable to Israel. They misjudge the Israeli position. But it is interesting to look at it and say, well, when they phrased it in their mind, they were looking at the Israeli attitude and they maybe misjudged, but at least they took it into account. So you had here a kind of a hidden dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in any case, the bottom line is that I'm not saying that Israel has had to respond on the basis of a take it or leave it. We are talking about the Middle East. You know, whoever offered anything, that was the beginning of something. So, but Israel has never responded. Never responded. I mean, really, officially, never responded. Once I confronted Olmert in one of my interviews, I confronted Olmert with the issue and I said, listen, Israel has not responded. He said, no, but I said many positive things, which is true, by the way. And Peres said positive things as well, true, but still, the government, what the government said, the government never responded.
So we've got two sets of questions coming in. One from one side, which basically implies that the Palestinians have too frequently said no or not put forward their own plans. And on the other side, there is the suggestion that Israel is not interested, frankly, in a peace deal. And then the third aspect is somebody asking, what is your idea of a generous proposal? So where do we kind of stand, from your opinion, on this? Obviously, clear different views from people, and all understandable in a way.
Well, the thing is that history is a complicated issue. And when you say everybody is correct, you know, it's quite frustrating because you want to have one good answer, one good solution, and there is no such answer. Let me say the following. Yes, it is true that the Palestinians, they not offer the plan of their own, and also they gave a negative answer to all of their recent proposals. This is an unfortunate fact. What can I do? I mean, my recent book in English was called Chances for Peace, Missed Opportunities in the Arab-Israeli Conflict, because I wanted to tackle the issue that they are saying that the Palestinians are not missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Okay? So I said, this is propaganda. I want to check it more thoroughly, more academically. All right, so I checked all the case studies, beginning with the Faisal-Weizmann Agreement in 1919, ending with the Abu Mazen-Olmert discussions in 2008 and 2008. And on the one hand, the result was that Israel missed opportunities as well.
Mhm.
But which opportunities Israel missed with the Arab countries? It missed an opportunity with Egypt in '66. I'm not going to talk about it, but anyone who's interested will go to that and read more. Israel missed an opportunity with Egypt in 1971 with Saddam. Israel missed an opportunity with the Arab peace plan, as I just mentioned. However, when you go to the Arab side, oh, let me add also that Israel on certain occasions missed peace with Syria, with Assad. Again, an Arab country. Now, if you go to the other side, what are the opportunities that the Arab side missed? So one big missed opportunity was the Syrian one, Assad, with Rabin in 1993. I think that was a huge missed opportunity. However, most of the opportunities that were missed, indeed, were missed by the Palestinians. What I can do? I mean, this is, as far as I'm concerned, is a fact, because I built a theory. I built a definition of what is a missed opportunity and applied it to any of the cases. So in 47, with the partition plan, they missed. With Clinton parameters in 2000, they missed. You know, this is a very interesting fact. I must say that I understand that I have to wrap up, but this is a very interesting fact. I just read Kerry's, the Secretary of State, memoirs, just published. There's a long chapter on the negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians, and he says something which is amazing. He said, I met Arafat after 2000, and he told me, this is the first time that I heard of it. He told me that he thinks that he made a mistake with Clinton, Arafat. And I think he is correct. He made a mistake.
Yeah.
And also Olmert gave Abu Mazen the most generous. I was asked about generous, go back to Olmert. That is no doubt the most generous Israeli proposal. What happened? He went back, he said, I'll give you an answer within a week. We are still waiting.
Well, on that one, Elie, I was there. I mean, Olmert was about to go to jail. He was about to resign as prime minister. The chances of him delivering on a major peace deal with the Palestinians on the basis of a piece of paper, I question that one, but on the others, I certainly agree with you on that.
I agree, I fully agree that the chances that Olmert could have promoted it are very slim. But you know, the Americans came with an excellent idea. You don't deposit your agreement with the American president.
Yeah.
So we'll have an opening with the next Israeli prime minister.
Right.
Idea.
Good.
No, he didn't take it. So I think that the bottom line is that though Abu Mazen is a very moderate leader and the most moderate so far, I think that unfortunately they made some mistakes, and we have to admit that. I mean, I hate maybe to admit that because I would want to see on their side also willingness to talk and to accept. We are not talking about the Trump peace plan. We are talking about almost ideas.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
were very generous.
Yeah, we need a new president in Washington, and we need a new prime minister in Israel, and we need a new leader in Ramallah. So we're just going to finish off, Elie, if we can, with you giving us just a little perspective on COVID in Israel. We think that many of our listeners follow what's going on in Israel and read about it, but you're on the ground there. What's your take on the situation, and how are you feeling locked up in your house in Herzliya? Please, go ahead.
Well, I was pessimist on the Palestinian issue. You know, I cannot offer any optimism on that front as well. I'm sorry. I mean, we started very well. By the way, at that time, as you mentioned, I was in London, and I saw the situation in London. I said, well, I better go home. So I went home, and that's what I found. You know, so I mean, it began very well. But the major thing, I think that in contrast to you in Canada and in Europe, in some, at least of the countries, most of the countries, that the medicine and the medical advice is dictating the political decisions, which is quite the opposite here in Israel. And what we find is that politics is dictating the medical situation. And that's what happened for many months without taking all the necessary precautions and without paying attention to the vulnerable communities and to some of the most problematic communities in Israel, which I want to say, and I don't think that I'm saying anything that can be maybe understood, you know, as if I'm saying something which might sound as racist. I hopefully not, this is not my intention. But what is happening in the religious, especially the Haredi community, and also within some of the Arab communities as well. And the fact they are not paying attention, they are not abiding by the rules. Even during Yom Kippur, I'm not talking about a month ago, I'm talking about Yom Kippur, going to the synagogue. We're talking about not hundreds of people, we are talking about thousands of people congregating together and without paying any notice. And the police is not willing to go inside and enforce the law or the rule or whatever has been decided in the Knesset. And the result is that we are going to face not a lockdown of 2 weeks, we are now going to face a lockdown which will be much longer, maybe a month, maybe even more than that. And only then to start slowly by slowly going out of the lockdown. These are the news from Israel. And it's very sad, it's saddening, I must admit, because on so many fronts, we are in the forefront of everything else. And in terms of what is going on here, leading now, according to statistics, we are more or less number one in terms of the percentage of people in the percent of population. I mean, even more than your neighbors, the United States. So this is the reflection, I think, the problems in our society. It's not only bad government. It's a reflection of some of the illnesses of Israeli society, which has not been dealt with for so many years, and as far as I'm concerned, will not be dealt with also in the near future, because nobody wants to deal with that hot potatoes, you know, relations between secular and religious people, relations between Jews and Arabs, and all these issues which we are saying in general in the left, they are so crucial that should be dealt with once and for all, but first of all, deal with the Palestinian issue and then move and deal with all these crucial issues. But for the time being, you haven't dealt with this big issue, the Palestinian issue, and you are confronted now. So you will have an excuse, and a good excuse, why not to deal with the Palestinian issue. These are the bad news coming from here or from Jerusalem. What can I tell you?
There were many other questions. I apologize to our participants. Questions about what a Biden regime would do, questions about a Nobel Peace Prize for Donald Trump, questions about the economic situation. I'm sorry to those who wrote in that we didn't get a chance to ask all your questions, but I just want to, on my own personal behalf and on behalf of all of our participants, to say thank you so much for your time, your knowledge, and maybe Gabriella can organize a second webinar so we can continue with some of these questions. Over to you, Gabriella.
Yes, thank you, John. I was thinking the exact same thing, that we must have another one because it's been so interesting and illuminating. Thank you very much, Elie, for your generous time and illuminating and also sobering thoughts. And John, thank you for being host extraordinaire. Thank you to all the viewers who posed questions, who watched. We're very grateful for your participation. Stay tuned for more webinars from us. And if you can make a donation to us, we would be extremely grateful, of course. And so Shana to all of you, Shana Tova to all of you. Stay safe, be well, goodbye, till the next time.